to know what you're doing in your practice. So I hope we have a little time to talk about that um, with your interface with the civilian and military community. And what do you hope to do in the future with this particular area? So with that, moving forward in that way, and I'll say that we're not going to talk about the physiology of the brain and what's going on with that in this particular lecture, and we won't be talking about things such as ACT or mindfulness-based stress reduction or relapse prevention types of programs that originated with John Kabat-Zinn. We'll be focusing on some practical things and then looking at the higher level sorts of things. So that's what you can expect in our program. So let's move on to the first slide and just know that there's a lot of stress. You might be, if you're in school now, experiencing some of that stress. And there's a great survey that I want to bring your attention to that talks about this. 65% of Americans rated work as their top stress in America, and that's the Stress in America survey. And you should go to the APA site and look at that. They have a number of those over the past years looking at different stressors in the survey. Just working with a general definition of stress, you can see that there. Demands of life exceeding one's coping skills, resulting in physiological consequences. Also could involve performance types of consequences. And that's really taken from Lazarus and Folkman at Berkeley and McEwen. Chronic stress over periods of time can cause different impairments, as you can see there, psychologically and physically. There's problems clearly in the military, from my perspective, as a veteran and a former active duty officer in the military with, overweight, obesity. Some folks are coming back clearly with TBI conditions. And then there's other sorts of conditions that we have to maintain our readiness in the military, our force readiness and health for our service members and also our family members in the military. So our outline today, we're going to be looking at stress in the military just a little bit, mindfulness resilience programs in the military, then some self-care, complementing integrative health in the military. Application, we'll look at an application in the military operations and current and future directions for the use in mind-body practices. And you can feel free to jump in at any time that you would like. And I see a question, so I'm going to respond to that question. Yes, you will be able to get these slides at some point in time, Chris Diaz. And hopefully you are looking at those right now. And I'm just responding to a chat question there. So, as we all know, military personnel make large sacrifices throughout their combat deployments and also throughout trainings that they go through military operations. As I think you probably know, it's less than 1% that are serving the country. And not only, do the service members make that sacrifice, but the family members make huge sacrifices with these separations. There's, I just want to take a minute and kind of speak to, all the different locations that we're at, just to kind of maybe refresh your memory, at least last year around this time. And I'm going to walk through the services right now just so you get a sense of this, that This is based on an article from Daniel Brown and Sky Gould that was in the Business Insider, talking about the location of where our personnel are. Of course, we're in Iraq right now, as you know, and this is the Army. We have a large contingent of troops in Kuwait right now at that particular time, and we may still have a contingent of troops in Poland there to address the situation around that area around Ukraine, as well as having personnel in Ukraine at that particular time training folks in the Navy. Of course, we've got the 5th, 6th, and 7th Fleet around the world, and large numbers of personnel are in those particular fleets. In the 6th Fleet, I think there's approximately 12,000 sailors, and 17 ships, and that's around Spain, Israel, and the Black Sea. In the 5th Fleet, that consists of approximately 24 ships and around 16,000 service members. And then in the 7th Fleet, there's probably about over 50 ships, probably over 35,000 sailors in the Japan and North Korea area. Let's not forget our Marines. Of course, they're in Syria and Afghanistan as well. Also had, back at that time, a group up in the Norway area. Air Force had 2 F-35s in Bulgaria, 2 F-35s in Europe. Also had different bomber wings in the Middle East, as well as F-16 fighter pilots in South Korea and in the Japan area. So you can see that we're situated all over the world, and we've been in constant operations since around 2001. The next bullet there speaks to that based on CareerCast, and it's talking specifically about enlisted personnel and their being in one of the most stressful occupations that there is, and based on these different things, not only the separation and operations and training that folks are involved in, but there's the sacrifice, there's injury, and the ultimate sacrifice of giving yourself to your country. You can see from the defense casualty analysis systems there back in 2017, and all of you can go on to the internet and go ahead and access this kind of information as well, that we had close to 7,000 members that have been killed and over 50,000 that have been hurt or seriously injured. So with that, a number of psychological conditions have occurred over the course of time. The VA talks about that percentage, 11 to 20% of personnel that have been deployed in those environments in Afghanistan and Iraq having PTSD. And of course, you've read the literature about this before with major depression and TBI, and that's from the research as well from our colleagues at the RAND Corporation. It's amazing the number of folks that are experiencing pain to me, if you haven't seen that before, that number, and then veterans as well with substance abuse conditions. The latter two conditions are starting to get more focus in the research areas, and I'll talk about a couple of projects that are underway right now in that. And the former areas, there has been a lot of money engaged in those particular areas for research. So looking at stress and stigma, you've heard, I suspect, a good deal about this, and I read about this as well. And this builds the stage for us in looking at why we might want to use complementary and integrative health. So just under half, as it says there, have sought help that had PTSD or depression. And there's different obstacles that they face and barriers, and there's a stigma that's been associated in the past, and hopefully been working towards remediating these situations so folks are coming in. But cultural change takes a long time in systems to make these changes. There's internal threats, the cognition that folks have themselves about going in and getting treatment. And then there's the sort of external threats, if I can characterize it that way, of the outside environment, the perceptions that people have of folks going. So stigma and care, the top reasons for folks based on the RAND research at that time was harm to the career, loss of clearance, a real preference to rely on family, just having that level of trust, talking to family, side effects with medication, and then maybe looking at your team, your coworkers, and feeling like, well, they may not have the confidence in me anymore. If I'm not, there for a period of time, then I'm coming back and they're having to catch me up and integrate me, and they'll be wondering about me. And those sorts of concerns are created in folks' minds if they're not familiar with this. More recently, there's been some high-level enlisted folks over the years that have had treatment. So this is a positive thing, and they've talked about it and been very open about that throughout their careers. So it goes on to say that more than half the service members needing treatment reporting seeing a health professional regarding their mental health condition previous to 12 months. But half of them, the folks who did present their conditions to the providers, didn't feel like they got adequate treatment from their perspective, and the reasons were the limitation in treatment and insufficient psychotherapy or insufficient psychopharmacology. So we're hoping there's a number of research projects going on, the STARS and Suicide program, the STARS program down in Texas, and then the STARS program, up in at USU. So we're hoping that these sorts of results are on the improve and improving. Just recently, we had a conference where Dr. David Jobs from Catholic University spoke, and he said, no time in history has the U.S. spent so much money on suicide and suicide programs and looking into that. And if you haven't looked into those areas lately, it's quite remarkable the types of treatments that they have. And Dr. Jobs is a good one. Also, Dr. Marjan Holloway, that's at the USU, the Uniformed Services University, up in Bethesda on the Walter Reed campus up there. So we can't really look at the impacts of these conditions, difficult situations that we've been involved in, and simply see them as a disease, as psychological health conditions, and of social problems that we have. We've had a call to action, I feel, and there continues to be a call to action to preload building resilience, readiness, hardiness, and in doing that through things like complementary and integrative health with mindfulness, with yoga, with meditation. There's some evidence that demonstrates that these have been useful strategies for service members. So I think it was a millennial study that said approximately 30% of service members had at least tried some form of the complementary and integrative medicine. So the idea here, of course, is to buffer stress using these different approaches that are mentioned through meditating, through using yoga, through using visualization, imagery, and things of this nature. In complementary integrative health, we'll also talk about a little later about acupuncture and Tai Chi. So service members with greater resilience, the idea, of course, is we hope that they have greater well-being and less challenges based on the resilience when they're going through combat operations and other life situations that are difficult, so we keep our force strength. As you probably know, it's a challenge in recruiting right now for our force, because when the economy starts getting a little bit better, then there's challenges with our force. So we want to maintain, in other words, our force, and this is a way of doing this. So as it says there, when practiced properly, these are great stress relieving processes and probably are a lower risk for adverse effects. So I want to talk about the body scan first. I'm not sure how I can find out other than folks saying that they're using something like this. So I'm just curious about how many people are using this in some way, shape, or another. So I'm going to put my mic on mute and see if anybody has a comment about the body scan, which is one of the mindfulness approaches that I use with folks. So I'll scan, listen. I'm going to listen and see if anybody has a comment on that, and then I'm just going to talk about it briefly. I'll give you 10 seconds if anybody wants to make a comment about that or anything. Okay, great. So based on many folks here, you've used it, and okay, so good. So let's just talk about, I'm going to talk about how I use this. And the group that I work with, as I think mentioned, is at the National Defense University, and you can comment if you want on the chat if you know what that place is. I won't bother mentioning what it is. I'll just say briefly, it's a location where there's a couple of the war colleges which train officers that are preparing to go on for strategic jobs and as general officers, and also they're called SESs, the senior service folks that are government employees, and then the intelligence community is also there having their personnel trained, as well as industry at the two schools. One of the war colleges is called the Eisenhower School, and the other one is the National War College there. So to bring leaders in and their staff to do this, it's really interesting process, and it's the body scan is simply the way I do it is you can do start at your feet is what I typically do, and I'll just do both feet at the same time. So you'll ask them to maybe do get into a relaxed space, teach them how to do that. We'll talk about that a little later on, and then just to focus on their toes, balls of their feet, the arch of their foot, their heels, and move up to their ankles. Now you can add another dimension to that where you talk about all those parts of their feet, and while you're mentioning each part, I'm going a little bit faster than I typically go because of the presentation here. Then you just ask them to release the stress. Feel the stress being released. See the stress being released is another alternate approach to doing that. And then feel refreshing, rejuvenating energy is another twist that you can throw in there. And take it all the way up to the feet. From the feet all the way up to the head. And then you might talk about the parts of the brain, the parietal, temporal, occipital, frontal lobe, and go through the same sort of process with the brain. Folks like that, it's interesting. One leader talked about using that. Actually, it's interesting, and if you've been teaching with folks and using this, he talked about using that particular process so he could perform better in swimming while he was doing that, because he was getting exhausted and tired swimming. So I thought, well, that's a very interesting way. I hadn't thought about applying the scan, but he was checking out each part of his body to see what part might be tired, and he was able to get through the swimming process that he was involved in. With this, so that's one example. As I said, I'll be mentioning different sorts of examples throughout this process, and I'll mention 3 others. With looking at complementary integrative health, we're going to have new business practices and models. Typically, the bean counters are not going to go ahead and afford us, a count of patients for these sorts of things. But they are starting to do that in different locations. They typically want you to provide a diagnosis and things of that nature. So I think we have to look at new models for measuring approaches like this. And of course, this can be used simply as an auxiliary approach as well. So there's the Total Force Fitness Framework. I'd be curious if any of you have heard of this before. If you can just type a little note on the chat area, if you would. So Admiral Mullen got this going quite a while ago, probably around 2010, as you can see down a little ways, 2011, 2010. He had got some different literature written, and there's 8 parts to the domain, as you can see in the second bullet there. And the areas that we might be more focused in are social, behavioral, and psychological. So in the social area, of course, how they categorize that, and these are all integrated into a holistic process. And Wayne Jonas, who's at the Sam Ellie Institute, was one of the folks, along with folks over at USU, kind of bringing this together. Patty Doister, Fran O'Connell, were kind of pulling all these pieces together, as I'm remembering back then. But the social area is looking at the family and also looking at units. So that particular area, what are important components for the family? And a group of us wrote something back in 2015 about that, the military family fitness model. Then Mark Bates took the lead on unit fitness back in 2013 and wrote a paper on that. And then psychological fitness, Mark Bates wrote something, I think it was about 2010, in that particular area. So those are all in military medicine. If you had an interest in taking a look at those different particular areas as sort of a larger paradigm and a shift from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff trying to kind of pull that together. Now you have to understand, he doesn't really have, he reports directly to the president,